The Choctaw people have had a long and rich history in what is now known as the United States of America. They originated from modern-day Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. One of the most important members of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma was Joseph Oklahombi. The actions of decorated Choctaw code talker Joseph Oklahombi broke new frontiers in wartime communication and led to significant Allied victories and triumphs during World War I, ultimately paving the way for the Navajo code talker's success during World War II. To understand just how impactful the Choctaw code talkers' accomplishments were, one must understand the odds set against their success. After receiving independence from Great Britain, white Americans acting as colonizers would legally force Native Americans out of their homelands and onto reservations when the Indians Appropriation Act of 1842 was passed. In the late 1800s, Native Americans were forced to attend Indian residential schools, where they were punished for speaking their native language, forced to learn English, and adapt to a Eurocentric way of life.
A lot of the code talkers were previous boarding school students. Joseph Oklahombi wasn't necessarily. He said that he only had a small amount of schooling. And that was one reason his English was not necessarily as good as some of the other young men. But the men that were code talkers that had a boarding school background, and a few even enlisted directly from boarding school, is information that we were given. They actually had been taught to march, to muster. They had a lot of discipline because of, and I'm talking about self-discipline as well as being disciplined, but they knew how to do things that people that were given basic training when they were enlisted were taught. So these Indian students already knew a lot of those things.
While fighting for their country in World War I, not all Native Americans had citizenship. All the Choctaw code talkers had U.S. citizenship when they enlisted. Everyone living in Oklahoma became U.S. citizens under statehood in 1907. The Dawes Act also solidified citizenship if a Native American accepted land allotments. Efforts of the Native American soldiers in World War I led to the reevaluation of citizenship. Honorably discharged Native American veterans were then granted citizenship, later urging all Native Americans to receive citizenship under the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Although the code talkers were important soldiers, they were not always treated as such. Many Native Americans were in similar situations, and sadly, Native Americans, like Joseph Oklahombi, were put on more dangerous assignments during World War I. 5% of Native Americans died during World War I, compared to just 1% of soldiers overall. This showed another blanket of racial discrimination that occurred, even during the war. For example, Oklahombi, the only Native American of his company, served as a scout during the contest of St. Eaton. Serving as a scout is one of the most deadliest positions while in a company, and Joseph Oklahombi did a job at it. He was a key figure in the contest of St. Eaton. Many people know about the success of the Navajo code talkers, but that would not have been possible if not for the initial triumphs that defined the Choctaw code talkers throughout World War I. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in 1914, a series of treaties led to Europe being engulfed in a war that stretched for 3.5 years, while at the time the United States remained neutral. Eventually, tensions grew in the Atlantic when German U-boat attacks on civilian ships increased in frequency, and the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted. Therefore, on April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson called on Congress to declare war against Germany. Back at home in the United States, Joseph Oklahombi came from a poor background, living in Wright City, Oklahoma, so joining the military made sense to him, where he would find opportunities to support himself. Joseph Oklahombi even walked 22 miles to enlist in the National Guard and fight in World War I. The Choctaw Code Talkers, originally the Choctaw Telephone Squad, came from the 141st, 142nd, and 143rd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. Training for the division would begin at Camp Bowie near Fort Scott, Texas. Men from across the country were joining the military to fight for the United States. 19 of these men would later become the Choctaw Code Talkers. Some of these men began their journey in the 142nd Regiment, two of whom were Solomon Lewis and Mitchell Bob. As Lewis and Bob were conversing in the Choctaw language, Captain Lawrence of Company E overheard them and had an epiphany. Lawrence wanted to use their native language to code secret information and stop the Germans from deciphering the Allies' messages. A few hours later, 8 men were gathered and separated individually into each company headquarters. The code talkers were then moved to France to continue their training until it was interrupted so that they could fight in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The final Allied clash in Europe was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which stretched from September 26 to November 11, 1918. It was the largest effort by Allied powers, with over 1 million American soldiers participating, including 19 Choctaw code talkers. Even with the Germans being highly skilled in decoding practices, they still had little to no opportunity to fight back against the great skill of the Choctaw code talkers in their tongues. The Choctaw language was by far harder to decode than any other language. For example, a machine gun would be called "Little Gun Shoot Fast," which made the messages denser. Joseph Oklahombi was not only a coder, but served in numerous roles on the battlefield. He was the only Choctaw code talker when he, along with 23 other soldiers, captured an artillery site at Saint-Étienne, France. They were able to capture 171 soldiers, killing 99 soldiers, and seize the artillery site as a whole. As an individual, Oklahombi crossed no man's land numerous times to gather information about the enemy and to assist his fellow soldiers. One of the Choctaw code talkers' most important calls came in late October. Their job was to transmit a coded message to the Allies containing coordinate information for the next attack. Because of their efforts, on October 27, 1918, the Allies managed to round up more than 500 prisoners in 30 minutes at the assault of Forest Farm. The German advances were halted within 24 hours and retreated within 72 hours. At the end of the offensive, the Germans were forced to surrender, thereby ending the war. Without the vital contributions of the Choctaw code talkers, and particularly Joseph Oklahombi, the German might not have surrendered, and the war could have been prolonged indefinitely. The Choctaw code talkers transmitted coded messages and helped fight off the decoding that the Germans were highly skilled in, ultimately leading to the Germans' chance of winning the war becoming slim. Only about a dozen lives were lost between the first release of the Choctaw code talker message and the armistice. The Germans' inability to decode Choctaw messages led to the signing of the armistice, thereby ending World War I. As soon as Oklahombi came back to his home of Wright City, Oklahoma, he lived a life of calmness. He never wanted to leave his woods and rivers again.
In fact, Joseph Oklahombi, at one point, Hollywood sent people out to see if Joseph Oklahombi would consent to making a movie about his wartime experience. And Oklahombi talked to them about it, but in a later interview, he was asked why he didn't go through with the movie, and his response was, well, he fished every day in the local creek, Horsehead Creek. And he said Hollywood couldn't take the creek to Hollywood, so he needed to stay there where he could fish every day.
American Indians and Alaskan Natives serve in the armed forces at 5 times the national average and have served with distinction in every major conflict for over 200 years. Without the honorable work of Choctaw code talkers, and specifically Joseph Oklahombi's great strides in the war, World War I would have been prolonged and the outcome could have ended much differently. Citizenship consideration for all Native Americans could not have been addressed until further on, and the Navajo code talkers would not have been nearly as successful in World War II.